So welcome to our unit on genetics. Here we want to start exploring how genetics impact all of us. The basic process of how egg and sperm are produced through this pathway we call meiosis, and then how when that works together with sexual reproduction, it leads to the production of genetically unique offspring. And that is a huge key I want to stress. Can't stress this part about genetics enough, is that when you are using the process or the pathway of meiosis, every offspring produced is going to be genetically unique. If we go back to the cell cycle and we look at how cells replicate, they're identical. One cell should turn into two cells and be identical, but when we talk about meiosis, one cell divides in half and then divides in half again, and you have four genetically unique cells. These are either eggs or sperm. That contains half the genetic material of one parent. That combines with the other parent's genetic material that is carried in the other parent's either egg or sperm, and the resulting offspring are unique. So what we're looking at here, the pictures, we got dragonflies. They are reproducing sexually. Male and female are mating, passing on their genetics. Same way with the lion, same way with the tortoises, and even that flower in the bottom right-hand corner. The bee is the pollinator. It actually picks up the pollen or sperm from that flower and carries it to another flower and unintentionally drops it off to help the other flower receive the sperm, and sexual reproduction is occurring. So think about, it's not just animals that reproduce sexually. Plants can do it, fungi can do it, other things can do it if we have different sexes. Now, when we look at reproduction in general, sometimes you have things that don't have sexes, but we call it sexual reproduction because the organisms are different mating strains. So that's definitely a bigger topic that'll be covered. You guys move into Bio 112, you'll go through life cycles in great detail. So if you can get comfortable with how this works now, it makes a lot more sense when you get into Bio 112 and you start looking at all of those life cycles. Okay, so let me share with you guys an experience I had when I came home a couple summers ago. It was late spring, early summer, and it was late in the evening. I'm going to my front porch, and I found two slugs reproducing. So slugs are hermaphroditic. They are both able to produce sperm and eggs. So what we'll see is some species, when they do sexual reproduction, it is simply you have a male that produces sperm and a female that produces eggs. Other species, they can do both. They produce eggs and sperm, and that's a characteristic of the species. So occasionally we hear about a person who is a hermaphrodite. That is a genetic abnormality. That is not a species trait in humans. But in slugs, that's the way they work. Earthworms, same way. So certain species, it is evolutionarily adaptable to be able to produce both eggs and sperm. Think about if you can mate with any individual in your population, it decreases competition for mates, it increases reproductive potential. You personally are able to pass your genetics and receive genetics. It doubles your genetic potential, or what we call biotic potential, your ability to produce offspring. So enough with the slugs. Let's think about something like dogs. These dogs are Rhodesian Ridgebacks. You have a male and you have a female. Both of them, once they've reached puberty or sexual maturity, both of them will start to go through the process of meiosis. Now meiosis, and let me add a text box here, meiosis is going to be specific to the ovaries in females and the testes in males. And there's a specific group of cells. These are called the germ cells. Now this doesn't mean germ as in, oh, I'm sick, this means a selective group of cells housed in your ovaries or housed in your testes. Those are the only cells in the body that are going through meiosis, the germ cells, or you'll see it called the germline cells. They go through this process, this pathway of meiosis. Everything else about these dogs, the hair, the skin, the muscles, the bone, the blood, all of those cells go through the cell cycle and mitosis. So when these two dogs reached sexual maturity, they were capable of reproduction. Prior to that, no reproduction. So now that they're reproductively able, if you combine the egg from mom and the sperm from dad, you now produce the next generation. We're going to call it a puppy. So mom's producing an egg, sometimes multiple eggs. Dad's producing sperm, lots and lots and lots of sperm from males, usually millions and millions of sperm from the male reproductive pathway. And those combine, forming the offspring. Now in this case, with these dogs, they had twins. She produced 2 eggs, and he produced millions of sperm, but it's only 1 sperm that will combine with 1 egg, and it produced twins. Now these twins, they're genetically unique. One's a boy, one's a girl. They're considered twins because they were born at the same time, but they did not come from the same egg and the same sperm. In this scenario, they are actually from different eggs and different sperm. So if mom had what we call the litter of puppies, 6, 8, 10 puppies, she's produced 6, 8, 10 eggs. Dad's produced millions of sperm. 1 sperm got to 1 egg, fertilized it, creating that individual puppy. Again, they're all genetically unique in this scenario. Later, we'll talk about how do we get genetically identical twins and what are the odds of that? What are the odds that if you produce millions of sperm and in the course of mom's life she's producing hundreds or maybe thousands of eggs, what are the odds that you could actually produce the same type of sperm and eggs during different reproductive events? Pretty small, but we'll talk about that later. Okay, so for now we go, good looking puppies. One's a boy, one's a girl. If you look at their chest, there's a different pattern of white there. You look at their nose, their mouth, there's different coloration patterns. You can tell they're genetically different. There's a little bit of difference between them because they are from, each of them is from 1 set of egg and sperm combinations. Okay, so what we want to explore with meiosis and genetics is how do you produce these kids and they're all different? What is the evolutionary advantage of diversity in your offspring? So to look at this, let's start with the basic process and the basic structures involved. Now, genetically, I want to make sure you guys are getting familiar with how we represent the genetics of a gamete versus a zygote, what's going on genetically here. Okay, so gametes, that is a term we use for the egg and the sperm cell. Gametes, because they contain only half the genetics of the parent, are represented with a lowercase n. So make sure you guys put that in there. That is what we use to designate a gamete, a lowercase n. Once the gametes combine, you take an N from the sperm and N from the egg, you have a 2N zygote. This is a structure that contains a full complement of genetic material. Apologies there. Full complement of genetic material. So gametes are always half, zygotes are full amounts of genetic material. And as we get into genetics, we'll talk more about, well, what happens if a gamete carries extra information and the zygote inherits an extra piece of information? Think about something like Down syndrome. If your gamete has an extra piece of DNA and the zygote inherits it, now it actually has too much information, or depending on the scenario, it may not have enough. So again, we'll get into that more as we progress into patterns of inheritance and actual genetic crosses. Okay, so gametes have half the information, N. Zygotes have full, so 2N. So another term I want you guys to make sure you're comfortable with is this term called haploid. So when we describe the sperm, because it carries half the genetic information, we call it haploid. The egg is also haploid because it carries half the genetic information. So haploid means half. Little n represents half the genetic information. When it combines and you get the zygote, the 2n, then you have what we call a diploid zygote. Diploid referring to full amount of genetic material. So the goal is every offspring should get, if they're produced through sexual reproduction, should get half their information from mom, half their information from dad. Okay, so let me show you guys a normal example. All of us listening to the lecture, watching this, think about your friends, your family. They were produced from a sperm and egg combining to form a zygote. But let me show you an example of where sometimes if we have genetic abnormalities, it's not good. Other times it is good. Okay, so let me show you an example here. Okay, so for all the biologists, bio majors, I want you guys to think about conservation and ecology for a moment here. Triploid grass carp. Triploid means they have extra chromosomes. Triploid. That's the equivalent of a Down syndrome individual. Somebody who is triploid has 3 chromosomes at a particular location. Those fish have been bred to be sterile. So when we look at management of ponds, often if you have a lot of aquatic vegetation, weeds, and it's overrunning your pond, people will use grass carp to eat the weeds. But the challenge is they don't want the carp to overpopulate, over-consume the weeds. If the population explodes, then it can destroy your pond. So you will stock a pond with a certain number of these triploid grass carp. And their job, basically, their ecological niche, is to feed upon the vegetation. And if there's so many of these fish, they help control the vegetation, they keep the pond cleaner, keep it safe, and a healthy, functional pond. If you use common carp, the common carp can reproduce, their population grows, that then depletes all the vegetation and can actually disrupt the balance of your ecosystem. But here's an example where being triploid, humans have found a benefit to it. So we've selected these animals to say, okay, we want them to be triploid, to have the extra chromosome, so that each individual in the resulting offspring, or each of these offspring in this generation who are triploid, cannot reproduce. So we can control the population size. It varies from pond to pond, but it might be 2 to 4, maybe 5 of these carp per acre of water to control your weeds. So I said genetically, let's go back to the previous slide, genetically the gamete should have half. So haploid sperm, haploid egg, that should combine and that should produce a zygote that is diploid, 2N. But in the grass carp scenario, what we're looking at is a triploid. Sometimes we will represent this as 3N, other times it's represented as 2N plus 1, meaning there's an extra chromosome there, being triploid if you inherit that extra piece of DNA. So in normal zygotes, always want to have them 2N, normal gametes, N, or haploid, creating a diploid organism. So what we'll take a look at with our grass carp scenario is what happens when triploids are produced. Where did the potential problem come? How did this happen? And when we apply it to people, what's going on in a person who's producing extra genetics in their sperm or their egg, and what are the potential consequences for the offspring. So what we'll start to explore in the next lecture is this diagram. looking at the circle, the meiosis